In 1939, the situation in the war felt oddly divided. Europe appeared quiet, even as violence escalated. Let's clarify what we're facing. We're in the phony war, complete with blackouts, cinemas reopening, and pubs and cafes filled to the brim. Yet, the ocean tells a different story. U-boats and raiders strike, Scapa Flow is compromised, and Britain's naval confidence falters. We'll examine Hitler's publicly stated desire for peace against his real intention for a Western offensive, the Venlo kidnapping debacle, a close call with an assassination in Munich, the River Plate confrontation, and the regime's first organized mass killings behind enemy lines. Next, we turn our focus to the Winter War, with Stalin's ambitions for Finland and the invasion. We'll see how the Finns use camouflage, mines, and ski troops to disrupt Soviet advances, and why Moscow had to regroup and relentlessly attack the Mannerheim Line, ultimately imposing harsh peace terms. Finally, let's broaden our view to East Asia to grasp the larger picture. The ongoing Sino-Japanese War features brutal conflicts in Shanghai, the Nanking Massacre, comfort stations, and the devastating flooding of the Yellow River in Changsha. We'll analyze how moves by the Soviets, Germans, and Western powers are fueling a protracted battle. By the end, you'll understand why these so-called quiet months were anything but, and how decisions made during this time set the stage for future disasters across both continents. Once it became clear that massed enemy bombers wouldn't demolish London and Paris right away, life began to return to something close to normal. A commentator described the war as having a strange, somnambulistic quality. Aside from the risk of bumping into a lamppost in the blackout, the main danger was being hit by a car. In London alone, over 2,000 pedestrians lost their lives in the last 4 months of 1939. The total darkness led to some young couples engaging in intimate activities in shop doorways, which soon became fodder for music hall humor. Cinemas and theaters gradually reopened, while pubs in London were brimming. In Paris, cafes and restaurants buzzed as Maurice Chevalier crooned the hit of the moment, Paris sera toujours Paris. The plight of Poland seemed almost forgotten. While land and air battles stalled, the conflict at sea intensified. For the British, it began with sorrow. On September 10, 1939, the submarine HMS Triton mistakenly sank another submarine, HMS Oxley, thinking it was a U-boat. The first German U-boat was sunk just a few days later on September 14th by the escort destroyers of the carrier HMS Ark Royal. On September 17th, the U-39 successfully sank the outdated carrier HMS Courageous. Almost a month later, the Royal Navy faced an even greater loss when U-47 broke through the defenses of Scapa Flow in the Orkneys and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak. This significantly undermined Britain's confidence in its naval strength. Meanwhile, the two pocket battleships roaming the Atlantic, the Deutschland and the Admiral Graf Spee, received the green light to engage in the war more actively. However, the Kriegsmarine made a serious error on October 3rd, when the Deutschland captured an American freighter as a war prize. This act, following the brutal invasion of Poland, shifted public sentiment in the United States against the Neutrality Act that prohibited arms sales to warring nations, leaning towards supporting the Allies in their urgent need for weaponry. On October 6th, Hitler made a peace offer to Britain and France in the Reichstag, expecting them to accept his occupations of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Yet the very next day, without waiting for their response, Hitler began talks with his top commanders and General der Artillerie Halder about a Western offensive. The Army High Command, the OKH, was tasked with developing a plan dubbed Case Yellow for an attack in 5 weeks. However, his senior commanders' concerns about redeployment challenges, resource shortages, and the late season for such an operation frustrated him. He must have felt further annoyance on October 10th, when a wild rumor swept through Berlin that peace terms were being negotiated with Britain. The joyful celebrations in the streets quickly turned to disappointment as Hitler's highly anticipated radio speech revealed it to be merely a fantasy. Goebbels was furious, particularly at the revealed lack of enthusiasm for the war. On November 5th, Hitler agreed to meet with General Oberst von Brauchitsch, the army commander-in-chief. Brauchitsch, pressed by other senior officers to resist an early invasion, cautioned Hitler not to underestimate the French. Due to shortages in ammunition and equipment, the army needed additional time. Hitler interrupted him, expressing disdain for the French. Brauchitsch then attempted to argue that the German army had displayed poor discipline and training during the Polish campaign, only to be met with an explosive reaction from Hitler, demanding specific examples. A visibly shaken Brauchitsch struggled to provide any on the spot. Hitler sent his commander-in-chief away, trembling and deeply humiliated, threatening that he understood the will of the OKH headquarters and was resolved to crush it. Halder, the army chief of staff who had considered a military coup to oust Hitler, now feared that the Führer's comment meant the Gestapo was aware of his intentions. He destroyed all potentially incriminating evidence. Halder, resembling a professor from the 19th century with his disheveled hair and pince-nez glasses, would have to absorb Hitler's frustration with the general staff's conservative approach. Meanwhile, Stalin wasted no time in taking advantage of the benefits from the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreements. Shortly after the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland, the Kremlin imposed its so-called treaties of mutual assistance on the Baltic states. On October 5th, the Finnish government was asked to send envoys to Moscow. A week later, Stalin presented them with a list of demands in a draft treaty. These included leasing the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviet Union, transferring several islands in the Gulf of Finland, along with part of the Rybakshi Peninsula near Murmansk and the port of Petsamo. One demand required moving the border on the Karelian Isthmus northward by 35 kilometers. In return, the Finns were offered a mostly uninhabited section of Soviet northern Karelia. Negotiations in Moscow dragged on until November 13th without resolution. Believing the Finns lacked international backing and the resolve to fight, Stalin decided to invade. His flimsy justification was a puppet government in exile made up of a few Finnish communists requesting fraternal assistance from the Soviet Union. Soviet forces instigated a border incident near Mainila in Karelia. While the Finns sought help from Germany, the Nazi government declined any support and advised them to yield. On November 29th, the Soviet Union severed diplomatic relations. The following day, troops from the Leningrad military district struck Finnish positions, while Red Army bombers targeted Helsinki. The Winter War had begun. Soviet leaders believed the campaign would be a mere formality, akin to their swift occupation of eastern Poland. Voroshilov, the defense commissar, wanted it wrapped up before Stalin's 60th birthday on December 21st. Dmitry Shostakovich received a directive to create a composition celebrating a significant event. In Finland, Marshal Carl Gustav Mannerheim, a former officer of the Tsar's Chevalier Guards and a celebrated leader of the war for independence against the Bolsheviks, was summoned from retirement to take command. The Finnish forces, numbering fewer than 150,000, many of whom were reservists and teenagers, faced the Red Army, which boasted over 1 million troops. Their defensive positions on the Karelian Isthmus, southwest of Lake Ladoga, known as the Mannerheim Line, included a network of trenches, log-lined bunkers, and some concrete fortifications. The Finns also utilized their dense forests and small lakes to channel the advancing enemy toward strategically placed minefields. Despite robust artillery support, the Soviet 7th Army encountered a grim surprise. Their infantry divisions were initially held up by screening forces and snipers near the border. Lacking mine detection equipment and under pressure to advance without hesitation, Soviet commanders recklessly ordered their troops to march through the snow-laden minefields in front of the Mannerheim Line. For the Red Army soldiers, who believed they would be welcomed as liberators from their capitalist oppressors, the harsh reality of battle shattered their morale as they trudged through the snow toward the birch woods concealing parts of the Mannerheim Line. The Finns, experts in winter camouflage, effectively cut them down with machine guns. In the far north, Soviet forces from Murmansk launched an assault on the mining region and the port of Petsamo. However, their efforts further south to breach Finland from the east toward the Gulf of Bothnia ended in spectacular failure. Stunned that the Finns hadn't swiftly surrendered, Stalin instructed Voroshilov to crush them using the Red Army's overwhelming numbers. Red Army commanders, paralyzed by fear from the purges and bound by restrictive military protocols, could only send wave after wave of troops to their demise. Enduring temperatures plunging to minus 40 degrees Celsius, ill-equipped and untrained for such winter combat, Soviet soldiers stood out in their brown greatcoats as they struggled through deep snow. Within the frozen landscapes of central and northern Finland, the Soviet columns could only follow a few arduous roads through the woods. They found themselves ambushed by Finnish ski troops who struck with rapid precision, equipped with Suomi submachine guns, grenades, and hunting knives to finish their victims. The Finns employed tactics they termed log cutting, breaking enemy formations into disarray and cutting off their supply lines, leading to starvation. Emerging silently from the biting cold fog, the ski troops would launch grenades or Molotov cocktails at Soviet tanks and artillery, then vanish just as quickly. This approach resembled semi-guerrilla warfare, leaving the Red Army completely unprepared. The Finns set fire to farms and barns, denying shelter to the advancing Soviet troops. They also mined roads and set up booby traps. Those injured in these assaults quickly succumbed to the freezing temperatures. Soviet soldiers began referring to the hidden Finnish ski troops as Belia Smrt, meaning White Death. The 163rd Rifle Division found itself encircled near Suomussalmi, and when the 44th Rifle Division tried to come to their aid, they were also ambushed and fell victim to the elusive figures moving through the trees. American journalist Virginia Cowles, who later visited the battlefield, noted, "For 4 miles, the road and forests were littered with the bodies of men and horses, along with destroyed tanks, field kitchens, trucks, gun carriages, maps, books, and personal belongings. The corpses were frozen solid, resembling petrified wood, with skin taking on a mahogany hue. Some bodies lay piled atop each other like discarded refuse, covered only by a gentle layer of snow. Others were slumped against trees in horrifying poses, all frozen in their final moments. I spotted one soldier clutching a wound in his stomach, and another struggling to open his coat collar. A similar fate awaited the 122nd Rifle Division, which was ambushed while moving southwest from the Kola Peninsula toward Kemijärvi by General K.M. Wallenius's forces. The first foreign journalist to witness the aftermath of the Finns' courageous resistance wrote, "How strange these bodies appeared along the road. The cold had frozen them in the positions they fell, slightly shrinking their bodies and features, giving them an unsettling, waxy look. The entire road resembled a vast wax museum display of a battle, meticulously arranged. One man leaned against a wagon wheel, holding a length of wire, while another fitted cartridges into his rifle. The world's outcry over the invasion resulted in the Soviet Union being expelled from the League of Nations, marking its final act. Public sentiment in London and Paris was almost more furious about this invasion than the assault on Poland. Stalin's ally, Germany, found itself in a tough spot. Although it was receiving more supplies from the Soviets, it now feared jeopardizing its relations and trade with Scandinavian nations, particularly Sweden. Most concerning for the Nazi leadership were the calls from Britain and France for military aid to be sent to Finland. An Allied presence in Scandinavia could disrupt Swedish iron ore deliveries to Germany, which were crucial for its war industries. Nevertheless, Hitler remained confidently reassured. He believed that fate was on his side, guiding him toward his grand objective. On November 8th, he delivered his annual speech in the Bürgerbräukeller in Munich, the same place from which the Nazis had launched their failed 1923 coup. Georg Elser, a cabinet maker, had secretly packed a pillar near the platform with explosives, but Hitler had cut his visit short and left for Berlin. 12 minutes later, a massive explosion destroyed the venue, claiming the lives of several of his loyal followers. One commentator noted that the news elicited a calm response in London, summarized with a dry British "bad luck," as if someone had simply missed a pheasant. With unwarranted optimism, the British reassured themselves that it was only a matter of time before the Germans would overthrow their dreadful regime. Elser was captured that evening while attempting to flee into Switzerland. Even though he acted alone, Nazi propaganda quickly blamed the British Secret Intelligence Service for the assassination attempt on Hitler. Himmler seized the perfect opportunity to promote this fictional connection. Walter Schellenberg, an SS intelligence officer, was already in touch with two British SIS agents, persuading them that he was part of an anti-Hitler movement within the Wehrmacht. The following day, he convinced them to meet him again at Venlo on the Dutch border. He promised to bring an anti-Nazi German general along. Instead, the two British officers found themselves surrounded and captured by an SS team led by Sturmbannführer Alfred Naujoks, who had orchestrated the fake attack on the Gleiwitz transmitter at the end of August. This failure was just one of many British secret operations that went disastrously wrong in the Netherlands. The British public remained unaware of this debacle, although their spirits were lifted later that month by the Royal Navy. On November 23rd, the armed merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi bravely took a stand against the German battle cruisers Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. In an engagement that was marked by remarkable courage, crew members fought valiantly until they perished, with the Rawalpindi blazing from bow to stern as it went down, its battle ensign still flying. Then, on December 13th, off the coast of Uruguay, Commodore Henry Harwood's squadron, consisting of the cruisers HMS Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter, spotted the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, which had already sunk 9 ships. Captain Hans Langsdorff, her commander, was well regarded for his treatment of captured crews. However, he mistakenly believed the British vessels to be mere destroyers and failed to avoid battle, despite having superior firepower with his 11-inch guns. The Exeter drew the Graf Spee's fire, sustaining severe damage, while Ajax and the New Zealand-crewed Achilles attempted to close in for torpedo shots. Though the British squadron was heavily battered, the Graf Spee, having also taken hits, managed to break away under a smokescreen and retreated to Montevideo harbor. In the following days, the British deceived Langsdorff into thinking their squadron had received significant reinforcements. On December 17th, having first disembarked his prisoners and most of the crew, Langsdorff scuttled the Graf Spee in the estuary of the River Plate and took his own life shortly after. The British celebrated this victory at a crucial time for morale. Fearing a similar fate for the Deutschland, Hitler ordered that its name be changed to Lützow, not wanting headlines worldwide to announce that a ship called Germany had been sunk. Symbols held immense significance for him, a fact that became even clearer as the tide of war turned against him. After being informed by Goebbels's propaganda ministry that the Battle of the River Plate was a triumph, the German public was stunned to learn that the Graf Spee had been scuttled. The Nazi regime worked hard to ensure that this news didn't ruin their planned war Christmas. They relaxed rationing for the holiday and urged the population to reflect on the supposed victory over Poland. Many convinced themselves that peace was on the horizon, as both the Soviet Union and Germany urged the Allies to acknowledge the reality of Poland's downfall. Propaganda films showcased children around Christmas trees, creating a sickly sweet atmosphere of German sentimentality. Yet, many families were gripped by a deep unease. Though they were officially told that a disabled child or elderly relative had died from pneumonia in an institution, whispers of suspicion grew that these individuals were actually being gassed as part of an SS program. Hitler's order for euthanasia had been signed in October, but backdated to the war's outbreak on September 1st to camouflage the initial SS massacres of about 2,000 Polish asylum inmates, some of whom were shot while still in their straitjackets. The Nazis' hidden assault on those they deemed degenerates, useless mouths, and lives unworthy of life marked their first, chilling step toward the systematic extermination of people they considered subhuman. Hitler had waited for the war's commencement to cloak this horrific eugenics agenda. By August 1941, over 100,000 mentally and physically disabled Germans would meet their end in this gruesome manner. In Poland, the killings went on, mostly by shooting victims in the back of the head, but occasionally using sealed trucks with exhaust fumes directed inside, and for the first time, in an improvised gas chamber in Posen, a process which Himmler himself came to witness. Alongside the disabled, several prostitutes and gypsies were also murdered. Hitler, who had vowed to put his love for cinema aside for the war's duration, also relinquished Christmas festivities. During the holiday period, he made several highly publicized surprise visits to Wehrmacht and SS units, including the Grossdeutschland Regiment, Luftwaffe airfields, flak batteries, and the SS Leibstandarte to Adolf Hitler, now at ease after its bloody campaign in Poland. On New Year's Eve, he spoke to the nation on the radio, declaring a new order in Europe. He stated, "We will discuss peace only after we have secured victory in the war. The Jewish capitalist world will not endure beyond the 20th century." He did not mention Jewish Bolshevism, even though he had recently sent birthday wishes to Stalin, also expressing hopes for a prosperous future for the peoples of the Soviet Union. Stalin replied that the friendship between the peoples of Germany and the Soviet Union, forged in blood, is destined to be lasting and strong. This phrase, forged in blood, referring to their joint aggression against Poland, showcased a level of shamelessness and foreshadowed troubling times ahead. As the year closed, Stalin was likely not in a good mood. Finnish forces had pushed into Soviet territory, and he had to confront the poor showing of the Red Army in the Winter War, which partly fell on the shoulders of his incompetent ally, Marshal Voroshilov. The world's perception of the Red Army's humiliation needed to change, especially since he was disturbed by the German blitzkrieg's striking efficiency during the Polish campaign. To address this, he appointed Army Commander S.K. Timoshenko to lead the Northwestern Front. Like Voroshilov, Timoshenko was a veteran from the 1st Cavalry Army, where Stalin had served as commissar in the Civil War, but he had a bit more creativity. The troops received new weapons and equipment, including advanced rifles, motorized sledges, and heavy KV tanks. Rather than relying on mass infantry assaults, the Soviets would focus on overwhelming Finnish defenses with artillery. A new offensive against the Mannerheim Line began on February 1, 1940. The Finnish forces faltered under the attack. 4 days later, their foreign minister initiated contact with Madame Alexandra Kollontai, the Soviet ambassador in Stockholm. The British, and especially the French, sought to support Finland's resistance and reached out to the Norwegian and Swedish governments to secure transit rights for an expeditionary force. Alarmed, the Germans began to explore the option of sending troops to Scandinavia to prevent an Allied landing. The British and French governments considered occupying Narvik in Norway and the mining regions of northern Sweden to cut off iron ore supplies to Germany. However, both the Swedish and Norwegian governments were reluctant to be drawn into the conflict, leading them to decline British and French requests to utilize their territories for assistance to Finland. With no expectation of foreign support, the Finns decided on February 29th to negotiate based on the Soviet Union's initial demands, ultimately signing a treaty in Moscow on March 13th. While the terms were severe, they could have been harsher. The Finns demonstrated their determination to defend their independence, but fundamentally, Stalin was not inclined to prolong a war that could potentially involve the Western Allies. He was also compelled to recognize the absurdity of Comintern propaganda and thus abandon his Finnish communist puppet government. The Red Army faced significant casualties, with nearly 85,000 killed or missing and over 248,000 wounded or ill. In contrast, the Finns suffered around 25,000 fatalities. Yet, Stalin continued to exert his retribution against Poland. On March 5, 1940, he and the Politburo approved a plan to execute Polish officers and other potential leadership figures who had resisted communist re-education. This was part of Stalin's broader strategy to eliminate an independent Poland in the future. Nearly 22,000 victims were transported from prisons for execution at 5 locations, with the most infamous being in the Kady Forest near Smolensk in Belarusia. The NKVD had kept track of the addresses of the victims' families when they were allowed to write home, leading to the rounding up of these families as well, resulting in the deportation of over 60,000 to Kazakhstan. Shortly after, more than 65,000 Polish Jews who had escaped from the SS but refused Soviet citizenship were also deported to Kazakhstan and Siberia. Meanwhile, the French government aimed to wage war as far from its borders as possible. Exasperated by French communist backing of the Nazi-Soviet pact, Daladier believed the Allies could weaken Germany by targeting Hitler's ally. He proposed launching bombing raids on Soviet oil facilities in Baku and the Caucasus, but the British convinced the French to drop the plan, fearing it could lead the Soviet Union to join the conflict on Germany's side. Daladier later resigned, making way for Paul Reynaud on March 20th. The French army, which had shouldered much of the Allied effort during the First World War, was widely seen as the most powerful in Europe and certainly capable of defending its homeland. However, more astute observers were not so sure. As early as March 1935, Marshal Tukhachevsky warned that it wouldn't withstand a German attack. He believed its major weakness was its slow response to threats, stemming from both a defensive mindset and a near-total lack of radio communication. By 1938, the Germans had cracked the outdated French codes. President Roosevelt, who was closely monitoring reports from his embassy in Paris, recognized these vulnerabilities. The Air Force was only beginning to update its outdated aircraft. Although the Army was one of the largest in the world, it was unwieldy, outdated, and overly dependent on the Maginot Line defense along the German border, which fostered a static mindset. The heavy losses from the First World War, particularly the 400,000 casualties in the Battle for Verdun, contributed to this entrenched mentality. Journalists and military observers noted that the political and social turmoil from numerous scandals and fallen governments had drained any sense of unity and resolve in times of crisis. Roosevelt, with impressive foresight, understood that the only chance for democracy and the long-term interests of the United States was to back Britain and France against Nazi Germany. On November 4, 1939, Congress passed the Cash and Carry Bill. This first setback for isolationists enabled both Allied nations to buy arms. In France, a sense of unreality remained prevalent. A journalist from Reuters visiting the stagnant front asked French soldiers why they didn't shoot at German troops visible in the open. They were taken aback. One soldier responded, "They're not bad," adding, "and if we shoot, they'll shoot back." German patrols exploring the line soon uncovered the ineffectiveness and lack of aggression in most French units. Meanwhile, German propaganda fueled the narrative that the British were making the French carry the weight of the war. Aside from some efforts to establish defensive positions, the French army did little training. Their forces simply waited. This inaction led to poor morale and a sense of despair. Political leaders began to notice issues like drunkenness, soldiers going AWOL, and the unkempt appearance of troops in public. One soldier remarked, "You can't spend all your time playing cards, drinking, and writing to your wife." He described how they would lie on straw, yawning, growing accustomed to idleness. Hygiene declined. Fewer soldiers washed, shaving became a forgotten task, and cleaning up after meals was neglected. Along with boredom, dirt took over at the base. Jean-Paul Sartre, stationed at an army meteorological office, found time to write his first volume of Chemin de la Liberté, and part of L'Être et le Néant. He noted that winter revolved around just sleeping, eating, and staying warm. That was the whole focus. General Édouard Ruby observed, "Every exercise felt like a nuisance, and all work was exhausting." After months of stagnation, no one believed in the war anymore. Not all officers were passive about the situation. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, who passionately supported the creation of armored divisions like those used by the Germans, warned that being inactive means being defeated, but his appeals were brushed off by annoyed generals. The French High Command's only effort to boost morale consisted of frontline entertainment featuring famous actors and singers like Edith Piaf, Josephine Baker, Maurice Chevalier, and Charles Trenet. Meanwhile, back in Paris, with bustling restaurants and cabarets, the popular song was "J'attendrai," I'll wait. Yet a more worrisome trend for the Allies was the rise of right-wing voices who suggested "better Hitler than Blum," referring to Leon Blum, the Jewish socialist leader of the 1936 Popular Front. Georges Bonnet, a leading appeaser at the Quai d'Orsay, had a nephew who, before the war, facilitated Nazi funding for anti-British and anti-Semitic propaganda in France. The foreign minister's associate, Otto Abetz, who later became the Nazi ambassador in Paris during the occupation, had been heavily involved and expelled. Even Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, a firm believer in fighting Nazism, had a concerning flaw. His mistress, Comtesse Hélène de Porte, a woman whose rough features radiated vitality and confidence, thought France should have never honored its commitment to Poland. Poland, functioning as a government in exile, had reached France, led by General Władysław Sikorski, who served as both prime minister and commander-in-chief. Stationed in Angers, Sikorski worked to reorganize the Polish armed forces, which consisted of 84,000 who had primarily escaped through Romania after their nation's fall. Meanwhile, a Polish resistance movement was taking shape back home, becoming the most swiftly organized of any occupied nation. By mid-1940, the Polish underground army had grown to around 100,000 members in the general government alone. Notably, Poland was among the few countries within the Nazi Empire where collaboration with the occupiers was almost non-existent. The French were resolute in their determination to avoid Poland's fate. However, many of their leaders, and a significant portion of the population, failed to grasp that this conflict would differ drastically from previous wars. The Nazis would not be appeased by reparations or the concession of a region or two. They aimed to reshape Europe in their own brutal vision. Many went without shoes even in winter, donning reed hats while toiling in the fields under the summer sun. Life was brief, making the older peasant women, marked by age and still moving slowly on bound feet, quite uncommon. Many had never laid eyes on a car or an airplane, not to mention electric lights. In large swaths of the countryside, warlords and landlords continued to wield feudal power. The plight of the urban poor was just as grim, even for those who managed to find work. An American journalist in Shanghai noted that picking up the lifeless bodies of child laborers at factory gates each morning had become standard practice. The impoverished also faced oppression from greedy tax collectors and bureaucrats. In Harbin, the customary plea of beggars was, "Give, give, may you grow rich, may you become an official." Sometimes the wish shifted to, "May you grow rich, may you become a general." Their sense of fatalism ran so deep that genuine social change seemed unimaginable. The 1911 revolution that brought down the Qing dynasty and ushered in Dr. Sun Yat-sen's republic was predominantly driven by the middle class and urban dwellers. Initially, Chinese nationalism emerged in response to Japan's blatant attempts to exploit China's vulnerabilities. Wang Qingwei, who briefly took the reins of the Kuomintang after Sun Yat-sen's death in 1924, became the main rival of the ambitious General Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang, slightly paranoid and fiercely driven, aimed to establish himself as the paramount leader of China. He was a slim, bald man with a neat military mustache and a shrewd political navigator, though not always a capable commander. He had once led the Whampoa Military Academy, promoting his chosen students to crucial roles. However, due to rivalries and internal strife within the National Revolutionary Army and among allied warlords, Chiang attempted to manage his forces from a distance, leading to confusion and delays. In 1932, following the Mukden incident and Japan's capture of Manchuria, the Japanese brazenly stationed Marine detachments in their Shanghai concession. Anticipating an even greater assault, Chiang began his preparations. General Hans von Seeckt, who had commanded the Reichswehr during the Weimar Republic, arrived in May 1933 to offer guidance on modernizing and professionalizing the nationalist armies. Seeckt and his successor, General Alexander von Falkenhausen, advocated for a protracted war of attrition as the only viable strategy against the more skilled Imperial Japanese Army. With limited foreign exchange, Chiang decided to exchange Chinese tungsten for German weapons. Chiang Kai-shek was a relentless modernizer, driven by genuine idealism during this period. He led a swift program of industrialization, road construction, military upgrades, and agricultural advancements known as the Nanking Decade. He aimed to end China's psychological and diplomatic isolation, but, fully aware of the nation's military deficiencies, he was determined to avoid conflict with Japan for as long as possible. In 1935, Stalin, through the Comintern, urged the Chinese communists to unite with the nationalists against the Japanese threat. This move was not well received by Mao Zedong, particularly after Chiang's assaults on communist forces had compelled him to initiate the Long March in October 1934 to save his Red Army. Notably, Mao, who was a large man with an unusually high-pitched voice, was seen as a dissident by the Kremlin because he recognized that the interests of Stalin and the Chinese Communist Party did not align. He believed, in line with Leninist thought, that war was a precursor to a revolutionary takeover. Conversely, Moscow prioritized its own interests over a long-term victory for the Chinese communists. As a result, the Comintern criticized Mao for lacking an internationalist perspective. Mao almost faced heresy when he argued that Marxist-Leninist principles favoring urban workers were unsuitable in China, where the peasantry should lead the revolution. He promoted independent guerrilla warfare and the establishment of networks behind Japanese lines. Chiang sent envoys to engage with the communists, seeking to integrate their forces into the Kuomintang army. In exchange, they would receive their own territory in the north, and he would halt his attacks on them. Mao, however, suspected that Chiang's aim was to force them into a position where they would be annihilated by the Japanese advancing from Manchuria. Chiang, on the other hand, understood that the communists were unlikely to compromise or collaborate with any other party in the long run. Their sole focus was on seizing absolute power for themselves. He remarked that the communists are a disease of the heart, and the Japanese a disease of the skin. While attempting to confront the communists in southern and central China, Chiang found himself unable to halt the Japanese advances in the northeast. The Kwantung army of Manchukuo clashed with Tokyo, arguing that this was not the time to make concessions with China. Lieutenant General T. Hideki, who would later become prime minister, warned that preparing for war with the Soviet Union, without first addressing the menace to our rear represented by the Nanking government, was asking for trouble. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek's cautious approach to Japanese aggression sparked widespread public outrage and student protests in the capital. In late 1936, Japanese forces pushed into Suyuan province, aiming to take over the coal and iron ore resources there. The nationalist forces fought back and drove them out, which bolstered Chiang's standing, making his conditions for a united front with the communists more stringent. The communists, alongside the Northwestern Alliance of warlords, struck at nationalist units from behind. Chiang aimed to completely eliminate the communists while negotiations were still in progress. However, in early December, he traveled to Xi'an for talks with two nationalist army generals who advocated for a firm stance against Japan and a halt to the civil war with the communists. They took him captive and held him for 2 weeks until he consented to their demands. The communists insisted Chiang Kai-shek be brought before a people's tribunal. After his release, he returned to Nanking, having been compelled to adjust his policy. There was genuine national celebration at the thought of uniting against Japan. On December 16th, Stalin, alarmed by the anti-Comintern pact between Nazi Germany and Japan, pressured Mao and Zhou Enlai to join forces with the nationalists. The Soviet leader feared that any disruption caused by the Chinese communists in the north could lead Chiang Kai-shek to ally with the Japanese against them. And if Chiang were ousted, Wang Qingwei, who preferred not to engage with the Japanese, might take over the Kuomintang's leadership. Stalin led the nationalists to think he might support them in a war against Japan, purely to ensure their resistance. He kept that possibility alive without any real intention of engaging the Soviet Union in conflict. The agreement between the Kuomintang and the communists remained unsigned when the clash between Chinese and Japanese forces erupted at the Marco Polo Bridge, southwest of Peking, on July 7, 1937. This event signified the beginning of the central phase of the Sino-Japanese War. The whole situation was a dark comedy that highlighted the frightening unpredictability of tensions. A single Japanese soldier got lost during a night drill. His company commander sought access to the town of Wanping to find him, but when that was denied, he launched an attack, prompting the Chinese troops to fight back, while the lost soldier managed to return to his barracks on his own. Ironically, the general staff in Tokyo was finally trying to rein in their zealous officers in China, who had instigated the provocations, while Chiang faced intense pressure from his own side to avoid further compromises. Uncertain about Japanese intentions, he convened a meeting of Chinese leaders. Initially, there were divisions within the Japanese military. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria aimed to expand the conflict, while the general staff in Tokyo worried about a response from the Red Army along the northern borders. especially after a recent clash on the Amur River. However, soon the Japanese high command opted for a full-scale war, believing they could swiftly defeat China before a broader conflict unfolded, either with the Soviet Union or the Western powers. Just as Hitler later did with the Soviet Union, the Japanese generals made a critical miscalculation by underestimating the outrage of the Chinese people and their willingness to resist. They also failed to anticipate that China's response would be a protracted war of attrition. Chiang Kai-shek, fully aware of his army's shortcomings and the unpredictability of his northern allies, recognized the tremendous risks a war with Japan posed. Yet he had little choice. The Japanese issued a series of ultimatums, which the Nanking government turned down, and on July 26th, their army launched an attack. Peking fell just 3 days later. The nationalist forces and their allies retreated, providing only limited resistance as the Japanese advanced south. Suddenly, the war was upon us, wrote Agnes Smedley, who arrived by junk at the northern bank of the Yellow River in a sprawling mud town called Fengling Tokau. This little town, where we hoped to find a place to rest for the night, was teeming with soldiers, civilians, carts, mules, horses, and street vendors. As we made our way up the muddy paths toward the town, we saw long lines of wounded soldiers lying on the ground on either side. Hundreds of them were wrapped in dirty, bloody bandages, some barely conscious, and there were no doctors or nurses to tend to them. Despite Chiang's attempts to modernize the nationalist forces, they, like his warlord allies, were far less trained and equipped compared to the Japanese divisions they confronted. The infantry donned blue-gray cotton uniforms in summer, while in winter, the luckier soldiers wore padded cotton jackets or sheepskin coats from Mongolian troops. Their footwear ranged from cloth shoes to straw sandals. Silent in their hurried movement, they offered no protection against the sharp bamboo stakes tipped with excrement that the Japanese used to defend their positions. Chinese soldiers wore rounded caps with ear flaps tied over the top, and they had no steel helmets, except for those they salvaged from slain Japanese soldiers, which they wore with pride. Many also sported tunics taken from enemy fighters, creating confusion during chaotic moments. A prized possession among them was a Japanese pistol. Often it was easier for Chinese soldiers to obtain more ammunition for the captured Japanese weapons than for their own rifles, which came from various countries and manufacturers. Their biggest shortcomings were in medical care, artillery, and aviation. Throughout battles, Chinese troops were directed by bugle calls. Wireless communication only occurred between major headquarters, which were often unreliable. The Japanese easily intercepted their codes, allowing them to know the Chinese troop movements and intentions. Chinese military transport included some trucks, but most units in the field relied on mules, beaten along with traditional curses, Mongolian ponies, and bullock-drawn carts fitted with solid wooden wheels. There were never enough resources, and as a result, many soldiers often went without food. Due to their pay often being delayed by months and sometimes misappropriated by their commanding officers, morale dipped significantly. However, the courage and resolve of Chinese soldiers during the Battle of Shanghai that summer is undeniable. The reasons and intentions behind this significant confrontation continue to be a topic of discussion. The conventional view suggests that Chiang sought to open a new front in Shanghai while maintaining pressure in the north and central regions to divide Japanese forces, preventing them from achieving a swift victory. This strategy would serve as his attrition strategy, as recommended by General von Falkenhausen. Launching an attack on Shanghai would also compel the Communists and other Allied forces to fully commit to the war of resistance, even if this posed the risk of them retreating to protect their own forces and influence. Additionally, it secured Soviet backing through the deployment of military advisors and the provision of fighters, tanks, artillery, machine guns, and vehicles, funded by exports of raw materials to the Soviet Union. The alternative explanation is equally persuasive. Stalin, concerned about Japan's advances in northern China, was eager to shift the conflict southward, away from his eastern borders. He achieved this through General Chiang Ching-chong, a regional nationalist commander secretly aligned with the Soviets. Chiang attempted multiple times to convince Chiang to launch a preemptive strike against the 3,000 Japanese Marines stationed in Shanghai, but Chiang insisted that he could not act without explicit orders. An offensive on Shanghai came with significant risks, as it lay only 290 kilometers from Nanking, and a loss there could lead to a rapid Japanese advance on the capital and into central China. On August 9th, Chiang dispatched a select team of soldiers to the Shanghai airfield, where they shot down a Japanese Marine lieutenant and his companion. Chiang later claimed they executed a Chinese prisoner sentenced to death to create the impression that the Japanese had fired first. Initially, the Japanese, also hesitant to engage in conflict around Shanghai, refrained from retaliation, merely calling for reinforcements. Once again, Chiang ordered Chiang not to initiate an attack. However, on August 13th, Japanese warships commenced bombarding Chinese areas in Shanghai. The following morning, two nationalist divisions launched their assault on the city. An airstrike was executed against the flagship of the Japanese Third Fleet, the outdated cruiser Izumo, docked near the Bund in the heart of the city. It was a grim beginning. The warship's gunfire successfully repelled the aging aircraft. Some munitions struck the bomb racks of one of them, leading to a deadly drop over the international settlement, hitting the Palace Hotel on Nanking Road and other areas packed with refugees. Consequently, around 1,300 civilians fell victim to their own plane, either killed or wounded. Forces from both sides rapidly escalated, transforming the conflict into the most significant battle of the Sino-Japanese War. On August 23rd, the Japanese reinforced their troops in Shanghai and landed on the northern coast to flank nationalist positions. Their armored landing craft deployed tanks, while Japanese naval gunfire proved especially effective, as the nationalist divisions had minimal artillery support. Attempts by the nationalists to blockade the Yanks were unsuccessful, and their small air force stood little chance against Japanese air dominance. Starting September 11th, nationalist forces, led by Falkenhausen, displayed remarkable bravery despite heavy casualties. Most divisions, particularly Chiang's elite troops, suffered losses exceeding half their numbers, including 10,000 junior officers. Chiang, uncertain whether to continue the fight or withdraw, eventually committed additional divisions, intending to draw international attention to China's struggle just before a League of Nations meeting. In total, the Japanese deployed nearly 200,000 troops on the Shanghai front, surpassing their numbers in northern China. By the third week of September, they began breaching nationalist defenses, forcing a retreat to the Suqiao Creek line in October, which, despite its name, served as an effective water barrier. One battalion was left behind to guard a warehouse, creating the illusion that the nationalists maintained a presence in Shanghai. This lone battalion later became a significant propaganda symbol for the Chinese cause. At the start of November, after more intense combat, the Japanese crossed the Suqiao Creek using small metal assault boats, establishing bridgeheads at multiple locations. Following that, with another amphibious landing to the south, they compelled the nationalists to retreat. Discipline and morale, which had remained strong through the fierce fighting and heavy losses, ultimately crumbled. Soldiers discarded their rifles, and refugees were swept aside in the chaos triggered by Japanese bombers and fighters. In just 3 months of conflict around Shanghai, Japanese forces faced over 40,000 casualties, while the Chinese suffered more than 187,000, at least 4.5 times that number. As they advanced rapidly, setting villages ablaze, Japanese divisions raced toward Nanking. The Imperial Japanese Navy dispatched minesweepers and gunboats up the Yangtze to shell the city. The nationalist government began its retreat up the river, mainly using steamboats and junks heading for Hankou, which would serve as the temporary capital. Chongqing in Sichuan would later assume this role. Chiang Kai-shek found himself torn between defending Nanking or surrendering it without a fight. The city was virtually indefensible, yet abandoning such a significant symbol would be a source of great humiliation. His generals were divided in their opinions. Ultimately, the result was a half-hearted defense that only provoked the attackers further. Japanese commanders were preparing to unleash mustard gas and incendiaries on the capital if the fighting escalated to the intensity seen at Shanghai. The Chinese knew their enemy was ruthless, but they could hardly fathom the cruelty that was soon to follow. On December 13th, Chinese forces evacuated Nanking, only to find themselves trapped outside in an unexpected encirclement. Japanese troops entered with orders to execute all prisoners. One unit from the 16th Division killed 15,000 Chinese prisoners, while a single company murdered 1,300. A German diplomat reported back to Berlin that, in addition to mass executions by machine gun fire, other, more personal methods of killing were used, such as pouring gasoline over a victim and igniting them. Buildings in the city were looted and set ablaze. To escape the violence, sexual assault, and devastation, civilians sought refuge in the so-called International Safety Zone. The ferocity of the Japanese troops horrified the world, revealing appalling mass killings and widespread rapes in retaliation for the fierce combat at Shanghai, an outcome the Japanese army had never anticipated from the Chinese they held in contempt. Estimates of civilian casualties vary greatly, with some Chinese sources claiming as high as 300,000, though a more likely number is around 200,000. The Japanese military leadership, through a series of clumsy falsehoods, insisted they were only taking down Chinese soldiers disguised as civilians, and claimed the death toll was just over 1,000. The reality was a nightmarish scene, with corpses decomposing on every street and in open areas, many of them scavenged by wild dogs. Every body of water was contaminated with the remains of the dead. These soldiers had grown up in a society steeped in militarism. Typically, the entire community would gather to send off a conscript heading into the army, honoring these martial traditions. For many soldiers, their motivation in battle came from a sense of duty to their family and hometown, rather than loyalty to the emperor, as many outsiders assumed. Their basic training aimed to erase individual identity, with recruits subjected to constant insults and physical punishment by their sergeants, a method designed to toughen them up and redirect their aggression towards the defeated enemy's soldiers and civilians. Since elementary school, they had been indoctrinated to view the Chinese as utterly inferior to the divine race of the Japanese, even beneath animals. One soldier later confessed that despite feeling sickened by the unnecessary torture of a Chinese prisoner, he requested to take part in the abuse to reclaim a sense of honor. In Nanking, injured Chinese soldiers were bayoneted where they fell. Officers made prisoners kneel in lines and practiced beheading them systematically with samurai swords. Soldiers were further ordered to use bayonets on thousands of Chinese captives tied to trees, with anyone refusing facing severe punishment from their sergeants. The Imperial Japanese Army intensified its dehumanizing training upon arriving in China. Corporal Nakamura, who had been drafted against his will, documented in his diary how he and his fellow soldiers forced new recruits to witness the torture of 5 Chinese civilians until death. Though the newcomers were appalled, Nakamura noted, "All new recruits react this way, but soon enough they will join in too." Private Shimada Toshio described his own baptism of blood upon joining the 226th Regiment in China shortly after. A Chinese prisoner was bound by his hands and feet to poles on either side of him. Almost 50 new recruits stood in line to stab him with bayonets. "I felt no compassion," one recruit recalled. The prisoner pleaded with them, saying, "Come on, hurry up," but they struggled to find the right spot. His insistence to hurry up implied he wanted a swift end. Shimada expressed the challenge of stabbing, saying the bayonet penetrated him like it would tofu. John Rabe, a German businessman with Siemens who set up the International Safety Zone in Nanking, observed in his diary, "I'm completely baffled by the behavior of the Japanese. They seek recognition as a great power, yet their actions reveal a crude, brutal savagery reminiscent of Genghis Khan." 12 days later, he wrote, "You can barely breathe from the horror of discovering the bodies of women with bamboo poles thrust inside them. Even elderly women over 70 are being violated." The group mentality of the Imperial Japanese Army, shaped by harsh training, created a hierarchy among soldiers. Senior members orchestrated gang rapes, with as many as 30 men assaulting one woman, whom they often killed afterward. New recruits were not allowed to participate until they were fully integrated into the group. They were also prohibited from visiting comfort women, in military brothels, girls and young married women forced into service by village leaders under orders from the dreaded Kempeitai military police, who needed to fulfill their quotas. In the aftermath of the Nanking massacre, the Japanese military demanded another 3,000 women for the use of the army. Over 2,000 had already been taken from Soochow when it fell in November. In addition to local women abducted against their will, a considerable number of young women were brought in from Korea. A battalion commander in the 37th Division even kept 3 Chinese women as personal slaves at his headquarters, shaving their heads to disguise their identities. The military leaders aimed to minimize cases of venereal disease and curb the public rapes committed by their troops, fearing these acts might incite resistance from the local population. They preferred that women held as slaves be assaulted in the privacy of comfort houses rather than out in the open. However, the belief that providing comfort women would prevent Japanese soldiers from raping indiscriminately was proven completely wrong. Soldiers showed a clear preference for random assaults over waiting in line at comfort houses, and their superiors believed that such acts enhanced their fighting spirit. In the few instances where the Japanese had to retreat from a town, they would often kill the comfort women in a fit of anti-Chinese vengeance. For instance, in Xuancheng, near Nanking, after the Japanese were expelled, Chinese troops discovered the bodies of a dozen Chinese civilian women in a building, while the sign on the door still read, "Comfort House of the Great Imperial Army." In northern China, the Japanese faced setbacks largely due to nationalist forces. Although the Communist 8th Route Army, who claimed to march over 100 kilometers a day, was kept from the heaviest fighting by Mao's orders, by year's end, the Kwantung Army had taken control of the towns in Chahar and Suyuan provinces, as well as the northern part of Shanxi. South of Peking, they captured Shantung province and its capital with relative ease, largely because of the cowardice of regional commander General Han Fuchu. Han fled in an airplane, taking the local treasury and a silver coffin with him, only to be captured by the nationalists and sentenced to death, where he was shot in the head while kneeling. This act was celebrated by all factions and greatly contributed to Chinese unity. The Japanese grew increasingly frustrated by the Chinese determination to continue fighting, even after the loss of their capital and nearly all their air force, and they were exasperated that, following the Battle of Shanghai, the Chinese managed to evade a decisive confrontation that could have led to their destruction. In January 1938, the Japanese launched an offensive north along the railway from Nanking towards Soochow, a vital communications hub linked to an East Coast port and positioned along the railway to the west. The fall of Soochow would expose the significant industrial centers of Wuchang and Hankow, now known as Wuhan. Railway lines held immense significance for troop movements and supplies, reminiscent of their role in the Russian Civil War. Aware of Soochow's strategic importance in a potential invasion, Chiang Kai-shek gathered around 400,000 troops in the area, a mix of nationalist divisions and allied warlord forces. The Generalissimo understood that the battles ahead were crucial. The conflict in China drew many foreign journalists and was regarded as a counterpart to the Spanish Civil War. Well-known figures such as Robert Capa, Joris Ivans, W.H. Auden, and Christopher Isherwood came to document the Chinese resistance against the Japanese offensive. The defense of Wuchang was likened to the Republicans' stand in Madrid against Franco's Army of Africa in 1936. Medical professionals who had treated Spanish Republican casualties soon arrived in China to assist nationalist and communist troops, with the prominent Canadian surgeon Dr. Norman Bethune among them. He ultimately died in China from blood poisoning. Stalin noticed parallels with the Spanish conflict, but Chiang received misguided optimism from his representative in Moscow regarding Soviet intervention against Japan. While the fighting raged on, Chiang sought indirect talks with the Japanese via the German ambassador, partly to pressure Stalin, but the terms were too severe. Stalin had likely been briefed by an agent and realized the nationalists could never accept such conditions. By February, the Japanese Second Army had crossed the Yellow River from the north, encircling the Chinese forces. By the end of March, they stormed into Soochow, where intense battles raged for several days. The Chinese had limited weaponry to combat Japanese tanks, but Soviet arms were beginning to arrive, and counterattacks were launched 60 kilometers east at Taichuang, where the nationalists claimed a significant victory. The Japanese quickly sent reinforcements from Japan and Manchuria. On May 17th, they thought they had surrounded most of the Chinese divisions, but 200,000 nationalist troops managed to break free by splitting into smaller groups. By May 21st, Suchow fell, and 30,000 prisoners were captured. In July, the first significant border clash occurred between the Japanese and the Red Army at Lake Khasan. Once again, the nationalists hoped for Soviet intervention, but their hopes were crushed. Stalin even quietly accepted Japanese dominance in Manchuria, as he was preoccupied with the German threat to the west. However, he did start sending military advisors to the nationalists, with the first arriving in June, just before General von Falkenhausen and his team were called back to Germany by Göring. The Japanese aimed to attack Wuchang and Hankow, just as Chiang had feared, and they planned to install a puppet government in China. To hinder the enemy's progress, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the breaching of the Yellow River dikes, intending to use water as a substitute for soldiers. This drastic measure, while delaying the Japanese by about 5 months, resulted in devastating destruction and civilian casualties across 70,000 square kilometers. With no high ground for shelter, the death toll from drowning, starvation, and illness reached 800,000, while over 6 million people became refugees. Once the land dried out enough for their vehicles, the Japanese continued their advance toward Wuchang and Hankow, supported by Imperial Navy forces on the Yangtze River, with the 11th Army moving along both banks. The Yangtze became a crucial supply route for their troops, safe from guerrilla attacks. By this point, the nationalists had received around 500 Soviet aircraft and 150 volunteer Red Army pilots, but with short 3-month tours, they left as soon as they gained essential flying experience. At any given time, between 150 and 200 were serving, and in total, about 2,000 flew in China. They had a successful ambush on April 29, 1938, when they correctly anticipated a large Japanese raid on Wuchang for Emperor Hirohito's birthday. But overall, Imperial Japanese Navy pilots maintained their dominance over central and southern China. Chinese pilots, despite flying inappropriate aircraft, often launched dramatic assaults on warships, which ultimately led to their own demise. In July, the Japanese bombed the river port of Kyukyang, likely using chemical weapons they referred to as special smoke. On July 26th, as the town fell, the Namita detachment perpetrated another horrific massacre of civilians. However, in the sweltering heat, the advance of the 11th Army stalled due to fierce resistance from Chinese forces and many Japanese soldiers falling ill from malaria and cholera. This allowed the Chinese to dismantle factories and transport them up the Yangtze River toward Chongqing. On October 21st, the Japanese 21st Army captured the significant port of Canton on the southern coast in an amphibious operation. 4 days later, the 6th Division of the 11th Army entered Wuchang as Chinese troops retreated. Chiang Kai-shek expressed frustration over the failures in staff coordination, intelligence, and communication. Divisional headquarters attempted to ignore orders from higher command to launch attacks. There was no depth in defense, just a simple line of trenches prone to easy breaching, and reserves were rarely positioned correctly. Yet, the next calamity largely stemmed from Chiang's decisions. After Wuchang fell, Changsha seemed exposed. Japanese aircraft targeted it on November 8th. The next day, Chiang commanded preparations for the town to be set ablaze should the Japanese advance succeed, citing the Russians' destruction of Moscow in 1812 as a reference. Mistaken rumors about an imminent Japanese arrival circulated 3 days later, leading to Changsha being set on fire early on November 13th. The blaze raged for 3 days, devastating 2/3 of the city, including warehouses stocked with rice and grain. 20,000 lives were lost, including all wounded soldiers, and 200,000 people found themselves homeless. Even with its successes, the Imperial Japanese Army was not complacent. Its commanders recognized their failure to land a decisive blow. Their supply lines were stretched thin and vulnerable. Moreover, they were acutely aware of Soviet military backing for the nationalists, with Red Army pilots now downing many of their aircraft. The Japanese leaders felt uneasy, pondering what Stalin might have in store. These worries led to a proposal in November for a complete withdrawal of forces behind the Great Wall in the north, contingent on the nationalists restructuring their government, acknowledging Japan's claims over Manchuria, permitting resource exploitation by Japan, and agreeing to unite against the communists. In December, Chiang's rival, Wang Qingwei, traveled to Indochina and engaged with Japanese officials in Shanghai. He believed that as the leader of the peace faction within the Kuomintang, he was the suitable choice to replace Chiang. However, few followed him in siding with the enemy, as Chiang's compelling vision of national redemption prevailed. The Japanese, having shifted away from a strategy of rapid assaults, opted for a more measured approach. With the threat of war in Europe looming, they anticipated the need to allocate some of their extensive forces in China to other conflicts. Despite the horrific acts committed by their troops, they naively thought they could win the support of the Chinese people. Meanwhile, the nationalist forces and Chinese civilians endured staggering losses. Approximately 20 million Chinese lives would be lost before the war concluded in 1945. The Japanese focused on smaller operations, mainly aimed at suppressing guerrilla groups in their rear. The communists actively recruited local civilians into their guerrilla militias, such as the new Fourth Army along the central Yangtze River Valley. Many of these peasant fighters were armed with only basic tools or bamboo spears. After the Central Committee meeting in October 1938, Mao enforced a strict policy. Communist forces were not to engage the Japanese unless provoked. They were to preserve their strength for taking territory from the nationalists, with Mao emphasizing that Chiang Kai-shek was their primary adversary, their enemy number one. Japanese incursions into rural areas employed brutality as a tool of terror, with soldiers often starting by executing young men in villages. They would bind these individuals and then violently kill them. Following that, they targeted women. Corporal Nakamura documented a raid on Lukuochen, south of Nanking, in September 1938, describing how they seized the village and searched every home, aiming to capture the most interesting girls during a 2-hour chase. Nura killed one person, marking her first act of violence. She was seen as ugly and was despised by many. The horrors of the rape of Nanking and other local atrocities stirred an unthinkable patriotic fury among the peasants, who previously had little understanding of Japan or even China as a unified country. The next significant battle occurred in March 1939, when Japanese forces advanced into Jiangxi province to target the capital, Nanchang. The Chinese put up fierce resistance, despite the Japanese resorting to poison gas. On March 27th, after intense house-to-house combat, the city fell. Hundreds of thousands became refugees, staggering under heavy loads or pushing wheelbarrows containing their meager belongings, quilts, tools, and rice bowls. The women's hair was tangled with dust, and the elderly struggled painfully on their bound feet. The Generalissimo ordered a counteroffensive to retake Nanchang, catching the Japanese off guard as nationalist troops entered the city in late April. However, this effort proved overwhelming. After threatening commanders with execution if they failed to capture the city, Chiang Kai-shek ultimately conceded to a withdrawal. Following Soviet-Japanese clashes in May at Khalkhin Gol, which led Stalin to dispatch Zhukov as commander, the chief Soviet military advisor with Chiang urged a significant counteroffensive to reclaim Wuchang. Stalin misled Chiang into believing an agreement with the British was imminent, while actually moving toward a deal with Nazi Germany. Chiang hesitated, correctly suspecting Stalin's priority was to ease pressure on the Soviet border. The nationalists were increasingly concerned about communist growth and Stalin's support for Mao. Yet, Chiang figured that Stalin's primary interest was keeping the Kuomintang engaged in the fight against Japan, allowing him to resist communist advances. This resulted in brutal confrontations, with Chinese communist sources reporting over 11,000 deaths. Despite the devastation of a tragic fire, the Japanese remained intent on seizing Changsha due to its strategic importance. Changsha was a clear target, located on the railway connecting Canton and Wuchang, both now firmly under Japanese control. Capturing this location would effectively isolate the nationalists in their stronghold in Sichuan. The Japanese began their offensive in August, coinciding with their allies in the Kwantung Army, who were engaged in battle with General Zhukov's troops to the north. On September 13th, as German forces pushed further into Poland, the Japanese made their advance on Changsha with 120,000 troops, organized into 6 divisions. The nationalist strategy was initially to retreat gradually while continuing to fight, then to let the Japanese advance quickly into the city before launching a surprise counterattack on their sides. Chiang Kai-shek had observed the Japanese habit of overstretching their forces, as rival commanders eager for glory moved forward without considering nearby units. His training initiatives since the loss of Wuchang proved effective, and the ambush succeeded. The Chinese reported inflicting 40,000 casualties on the Japanese. During this time, Stalin's primary goal was to prevent the conflict with Japan from escalating while secretly negotiating with Germany, even as Zhukov won battles. However, the announcement of the Nazi-Soviet pact deeply unsettled Japanese leaders, who found it hard to believe that their German allies could make a pact with the communist adversary. Meanwhile, Stalin's decision not to engage with the Japanese following Zhukov's success was a significant setback for the nationalists. The ceasefire on the Mongolian and Siberian fronts allowed the Japanese to focus on fighting the Chinese without worrying about threats from the Soviet North. Chiang Kai-shek was concerned that the Soviet Union and Japan might secretly agree to divide China, similar to the Nazi-Soviet division of Poland. Conversely, Mao viewed this possibility favorably, as it would bolster his power at the nationalists' expense. Chiang was also troubled when Stalin decreased the military support provided to the nationalists. With the outbreak of war in Europe in September, hopes for assistance from the British and French dwindled further. The nationalists faced a dire situation as the lack of external help became more severe, especially after losing their main industrial centers and tax revenues. The Japanese invasion posed not just a military threat, it also devastated harvests and food supplies. Banditry surged as deserters and stragglers formed gangs that roamed the land. Tens of millions of refugees were desperately fleeing westward, seeking to protect their families from the brutality of Japanese soldiers. Overcrowded cities, rife with unsanitary conditions, led to cholera outbreaks. Malaria spread to new areas as people moved in large numbers. Typhus, carried by lice, became a common affliction among those fleeing. Despite significant efforts to improve medical services in China, both for the military and civilians, the few available doctors struggled to assist refugees suffering from a variety of ailments, including ringworm and scabies, all made worse by deepening poverty and severe malnutrition. However, buoyed by their success in Changsha, the nationalists initiated a series of counterattacks in a winter offensive throughout central China. Their goal was to disrupt the supply lines of vulnerable Japanese garrisons by hindering river traffic on the Yangtze and cutting off railway communication. But as nationalist forces launched their attacks in November, the Japanese swiftly invaded the southwestern province of Guangxi with an amphibious assault. On the 24th of November, they captured Nanning, threatening the railway to French Indochina. The small number of nationalist troops in the area were caught off guard and retreated hastily. Chiang Kai-shek quickly sent reinforcements, resulting in 2 months of fierce fighting. The Japanese claimed to have killed 25,000 Chinese in a single battle. Other Japanese offensives further north captured vital areas for nationalist grain supplies and recruitment. They also increased their bomber presence in China, launching raids deep into nationalist territory and targeting their new capital, Chongqing. Meanwhile, the communists quietly struck a deal with the Japanese, agreeing not to attack railways in exchange for leaving their new Fourth Army alone in the countryside. The global situation was bleak for the nationalists, as Stalin allied with Germany and advised Chiang Kai-shek against any engagements with Britain and France, fearing they intended to draw him into conflict with Japan. In December 1939, amid the winter war against Finland, The nationalists faced an agonizing dilemma as the Soviet Union confronted the possibility of being expelled from the League of Nations due to its invasion. They were wary of provoking Stalin, but they couldn't use their veto to protect him without upsetting the Western powers. Ultimately, their representative chose to abstain, which frustrated Moscow and failed to appease the British and French. As a result, Soviet military supplies plummeted and didn't return to previous levels for a whole year. To urge Stalin to yield, Chiang Kai-shek hinted at potential peace talks with the Japanese. Nevertheless, the nationalists increasingly placed their hopes on the United States, which had begun to denounce Japanese aggression and bolster its bases in the Pacific. However, Chiang Kai-shek was also grappling with two significant internal challenges. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao, was becoming more aggressive, expanding its territory behind Japanese lines and claiming it would ultimately defeat the Kuomintang after the Sino-Japanese War. Meanwhile, on March 30th, 1940, the Japanese set up Wang Qingwei's national government, known as the Reformed Kuomintang, in Nanking. The true nationalists dismissed him as the criminal traitor and worried that his government might gain recognition not just from Germany and Italy, Japan's only European allies, but also from other foreign powers.